Well, we can get started, right? Well, thank you all for being here on this Valentine's Day, especially younger researchers. So that shows your true commitment to digital health, solutions. All right, it's my honor to introduce our speaker. We have an amazing speaker today. My longtime colleague, friend, and mentor, Dr. Diane Cook from Washington State University. Diane is a Regents professor in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Washington State University. She is the founding director of the WSU Center for Advanced Studies in Adaptive Systems. She's co-director of the WSU AI Lab. She's a fellow of the IEEE and recently also ACM. And she's a fellow of National Academy of Inventors. Diane's work is featured in BBC, IEEE The Institute, IEEE Spectrum, Smithsonian, the White House Fact Sheet, Scientific American, the Wall Street Journal, AARP Magazine, HGTV, ABC News, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So I have looked at Diane's CV, so if you want to just list her accomplishments, we need a dedicated session for that. So without further ado, I would like to invite Diane to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hassan. I think that's more an indication of my age than accomplishments, but thank you. So, digital twins, as you know, have really disrupted many industries because we can build a complete model of an item like, say, a car tire, and put all that we understand into it, and that allows us to try out simulations of different changes we want to make before we actually implement them and deploy them. Well, we hypothesize that we can maybe look at the same approach to understanding humans, human health, and human behavior. And that's the goal of a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today. And as an example, consider a fictitious patient, Jane, where she presents with type 2 diabetes, but she has confounds. She also is experiencing cognitive decline. So a lot of digital health studies will look at one condition in isolation and maybe look at a correlation with one digital marker. But with a digital twin, we feel like we can look at many more interacting components to put together a whole model. So yes, we can collect her vital signs in the lab, but let's also try to look at her behavior, not only just to detect the correlation between behavior, maybe change in behavior, and changes in her physical and cognitive health, but so that we can actually see if there are controllable behaviors that could improve her health state. Let's look at genetics, let's look at her social interactions, and let's look at the environment in which she lives. And so what we're interested in doing is using different kinds of sensing and machine learning to piece together these different components of what makes up the person, including all the different conditions that she is trying to manage into a whole picture. This is what we're looking at, and what makes this really challenging, so I'm going to be transparent with you and tell you about our challenges and our failures along the way, is that we're going to try to do this in the wild. And if we start with traditional approaches, they are feasible, they are interpretable, they are reliable, they're based on many trials, and they are known to be accurate. However, they are limiting because a person comes into the clinic, they get a half-hour, 1-hour visit, they get a small snapshot of what's going on with that person. under conditions that are different from where they normally live their daily life. So ideally, we would move toward having this kind of assessment and intervention in people's natural settings. It's more ecologically valid, it's more accessible for older adults living in remote settings that cannot easily drive to a care provider or clinic. It's typically more affordable, and now you get continuous data, not just a 1 hour, but you can see everything that's been going on for months up until that visit, and longitudinally you can look at this person's information over months or years to perhaps even predict what might be coming up and circumvent it. So we strive for a balance. We are not yet perfectly capable of operating in the wild, so what we do with every step that we look at in sensing and machine learning is try to move a little bit closer toward that goal. And what we are going to do in our lab at Washington State University is, in the wild, collect sensor data. And we have looked at a variety of types of sensor data, but what I'm going to be focusing on today are two types. One is from data that we collect via ambient sensors that are placed in smart homes and other environments, and the other is through wearables. But as all of you who work in digital health and machine learning know, you try to make your methods as sensor agnostic as possible. So we have also played with and integrated environmental quality sensors, microphones, cameras, depth cameras, item sensors. So the same ideas would apply there as well. And let me just say, how I got into this area, since we're going to talk about smart homes, is 25 years ago, so that's why my CV is long. I went to the Texas State Fair, and they had what they called a smart home. And I got really excited because my area was machine learning. I wanted to have a practical application that would have some societal impact. So I went and toured the smart home, and it was a connected home. You had the ability to control when your washing machine would go off. Your refrigerator would make a grocery list for you, so you could send it to, I don't know if anybody here is as aged as me, but homegrocer.com, who would then deliver the groceries, I guess these days DoorDash. And I felt that that was a connected home, but not a smart home. A smart home needs to be able to sense what's going on, identify, and then assess the state of the environment and the people living there in order to take an action that will promote the well-being and whatever you want to optimize. So that's what we're going to try to do in terms of our digital twin. We're going to try to sense what is going on with the person and the environment in which they live, identify specific markers of interest, assess whatever health measures we're after. In this case, I will focus primarily on cognitive health, but also some physical health applications, and then use that information to intervene in a manner that is aware of the person's context and state. And then it's not right to leave it there. We need to close the loop and see what the impact is of the intervention and make adjustments. So having said that, let me give you an introduction to the two sensing platforms I'll focus on. One is the smart home. And this example of a smart home is just an on-campus apartment that we've used for experiments. We have a student living there, and you can see on the ceiling there are what looks like smoke detectors, but they are passive infrared motion detectors that have an ambient light sensor coupled with it. And then as she opens these cabinets, there are, you can see maybe at the very top, a magnetic door sensor that indicates when the door has been opened shut. And inside that same housing is an ambient temperature sensor. And unlike other types of sensors in this setting, each sensor does some internal sampling at a fixed rate, but they only report information when there's a change in state. So on the left, you see a text stream that comes by as she moves through the space. And on the lower left, you see just a visualization of her moving. So the question is, can we gather data from that in order to start to build a digital twin and perform assessment and intervention. Now, when we first started doing this, I was actually in Texas, and we put a few sensors into a student's apartment, and our goal was just to see, can we predict interactions with the apartment? And it was an undergraduate living there, and we felt if we could predict an undergraduate, we could predict anybody. We did not expect to do much, and this is back with Control 4. We didn't have wireless technology, and shockingly, we could. And I think even though undergraduates' patterns may shift a bit in terms of time of day, there's still certain routines that you go through that are important to you. And what was even more interesting is we gave them a remote, and we said, we're going to start automating these interactions for you, and every time it's wrong, hit the remote so we can record whether we were right or wrong for reinforcement learning. But instead of the home adapting to him, he started to adapt to the home because the remote was way over on the other side of the apartment. So he just started changing his behaviors in order to minimize the effort. And that was a little bit scary, but also enlightening that, yes, we can make a difference in behavior, which with the digital twin we see does connect to health. So that's the smart home. And then we'll also be looking at wearables, and so many of you work in that space. You know that we primarily use Apple Watches, so we collect 3D motion, as you can see there. And we also collect location because we are interested in functional activities. So we want to know about people socializing and going on errands and things like that, which are really extracted from location. And then also on the watches, which we use for multiple studies, we will collect, from location we can look at environment quality, air quality, walkability. We can look at the deprivation index to see what kind of community that they're looking at. We also will deliver interactive EMA questions to get in the moment self-assessment, and we've started developing cognitive tasks as well. Like on the watch, we have a one-back shape test that they can perform for 45 seconds where it shows either a circle, triangle, or square, and then it shows another shape, and you just press yes, no, whether it's the same shape as the previous one for 45 seconds. So you can close the whole loop through such a wearable. So from sensing, we then go to identifying, and we can extract a lot of digital markers. So from the home, we can look at things like how much time are they in the home, out of the home, how much movement is there in the space, how many different rooms do they go to, and very similar markers for the watch as well. But what becomes tricky is that it'd be nice to go beyond hard-coded movement markers to understand functional activities. And this is the task of activity recognition, and the reason that we perform this is when we are trying to assess a person's cognitive health, our ground truth is traditional cognitive assessment laboratory tasks. And those are based on functional activities. How well can you manage complicated activities like paying your finances, doing chores, going on errands? And this is a lot more complicated than just looking at movement markers. And so this is some of the challenges. This is just a chart showing what we typically go through. And some of the challenges are you get raw data, and let's focus on wearable for a minute. And the wearable data needs to be cleaned up a lot because even with movement, you can get drift, you can get gravitational influences. With location, whenever the location services used to get confused, it would put their location as being in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle for some reason. So a lot of anomalies that we have to deal with when we pre-process the data, and of course missing data. And I found out not only the students that participated in some of our studies, but even my collaborators, we wanted to know what their behavior context looked like when they answered an EMA question, but they got tired of wearing the watch, so they just put it next to them and they grabbed it when it was time to answer the question. So we have to be able to detect situations when they're not even wearing the watch. So data pre-processing, segmentation so that we can look at a fixed sliding window of information at a time, extract some features, and then use machine learning to identify which activity this is. It seems straightforward, but if you're going to do this in the wild, then you have to recognize that there's a variety of how activities are being performed. If we want to know when they're exercising, what does that mean? So that could mean, like in the lower right, walking on a treadmill, or it could mean, like in the upper left, doing some yoga. We want to be able to recognize when they're taking medicine and cooking, but we also want to recognize when they're interacting with friends and families. And we want to know when there's a health condition of interest, like this gentleman on the left who has fallen. And that is just downright challenging. So many issues. Obviously, a lot of sensor noise, like I mentioned. But also, we're finding that when we get into the more functional activities, there's a lot of semantic ambiguity, because what is work for us is a hobby for somebody else. And when we are doing something, we typically are not just doing one activity. You know, an older adult could be sitting in their favorite chair, talking on the phone, maybe reading also, and watching TV at the same time. So there's this multi-label problem. But, you know, fortunately for those of us who are in machine learning, that makes it fun. We have to deal with the fact that the time spent on different activities is very imbalanced, so we have to find ways to reshape the space. We've done some work, this is for the machine learning people, on improving change point recognition, because if we can identify when a person is transitioning in activities from one to another, that's a great time to deliver an intervention. It's also helpful information in trying to figure out the activity, because it's nice to know, all right, how far back does this activity go? Domain adaptation is absolutely necessary, because one person's kinematics are going to be different from another, and one person's way of performing an activity is different from another. So we have to be able to take whatever we learn from me and apply it to Hassan as well. And then the last two I'll talk about a little bit in the context of our actual studies: multitask prediction and contrastive pre-training. But let's complete the cycle first and go from sensing to identifying to assessment. And I'll sprinkle in some of these applications with our challenges. This was our very first one. We had put sensors in our on-campus apartment and got through so many problems, like UPS backup devices literally exploding, and on, to putting sensors in people's homes. And this was our first study in which people were so willing to participate that we collected data for up to 7 years for individuals while they performed their normal daily routines. And this was the first study of this type, so we made a lot of mistakes. And what we did do in the smart home, we collected the data that I showed you on the screen with Jess moving through her kitchen, and we did all that data pre-processing pipeline that I showed you. And then every 6 months, where you see that red arrow, was an assessment point. And so our clinical neuropsychology team would go and visit these people in person and get ground truth clinical measures. Our task was to see, could we take the 6 months worth of behavior markers leading up to that assessment point and predict what those measures would be. We had no idea how this would go. And it was interesting, because when my first PhD student at Washington State tried this, and he was getting correlations of 0.4, he was like, oh, Dr. Cook, this is never going to work. It's not going to get published. You know, in machine learning, if it's less than 95% accuracy, you're out of here. But for working with humans and human variability, that was actually encouraging, that there's a correlation there that we can build on. So some of the clinical scores in this case were R-bands for cognitive health, TUG for mobility and cognitive health. And then my collaborator came up with a new measure, IADLC, instrumental activities of daily living. We're self-reporting not only how well you can perform those functional activities I was talking about, but how well can you use compensatory devices. So it's IADLC. If you have memory issues but you can adapt very well, then you're still able to perform functions quite independently. And you can see that we got moderate to large correlations eventually between these markers and the clinical scores. So that was a good baseline, but it was still kind of ideal circumstances, because these people didn't have pets. They lived alone. There are so many issues that we're trying to strip away one at a time, very gingerly. All right, so that's one piece of the digital twin puzzle. And now let me look at a second one. And the only reason for putting this up here is to motivate a multimodal kind of digital twin approach to assessment. And this was an example in which we collected not only smart home data, but smart watch data. And what's interesting here is that the different colors indicate which perform best, one information source, the other, or both. And you can see there's no one color that is dominating, showing that you really need to get more of a holistic picture of the person. And the other thing of note, I mentioned I would be talking about multitask learning or joint prediction. In this case, there were multiple measures of cognition, and we predicted them all at the same time, and then we would use the predictions as input to a second round of learning so that you can actually learn the relationship between the individual measures, because there is overlap and there is a connection between them. And the joint inference always outperforms looking at one. So again, it's important to look at multiple measures. It's important to look at the multiple health conditions and multiple facets of a person's well-being. So that is how we start to complete the digital twin picture. So I'm going back and forth between talking about what we did and how it worked and just throwing out the absolute challenges here. So what I am just finishing up right now is if we can perform that kind of assessment with those early homes, can we do it with a much larger set of homes? So we have now collected longitudinal data in over 200 homes, 137 of which have clinical diagnoses of cognitive health. So either healthy or subjective cognitive decline or mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia. But these are more realistic. So these are not only single resident homes, but these are multiple resident homes. And this is what it looks like when you are tracking multiple residents in the space. It's just like pinball, and you can go through and try to carefully track the movements of each person, and that is really hard. We've tried. And then even if you do, you have to know which person you're looking at. So what can we do here? Well, we can look at individual markers and try to compare them between the groups. So we can look at healthy older adults, which includes healthy and subjective decline, and those experiencing some cognitive changes, so MCI and mild dementia. And we see a few obvious changes, like the healthy group transitions to outside. They go outside more on outings. And their routine similarity, so if we actually compute the similarity across days, is more structured. And they have fewer sleep interruptions, but not everything makes sense. And if we feed that into machine learning algorithms that are very commonly used, so logistic regression, for example, and decision trees, they predict clinical diagnosis with an almost random result. It's just super hard. I mean, some of these homes have 2 residents and 6 pets. So it's just pinball. So we wanted to see, okay, if we use nonlinear methods, so we start with a temporal convolutional network, so it's going to look for patterns over time because we extract those behavior markers each day. Can it do a little bit better? And then we go one step further because this multi-house, multi-resident aspect is very difficult. So we do some contrastive pre-training where in the machine learning world, this has been quite effective for trying to separate points in that latent space where the networks map them in order to create a bigger space between points and make it easier to divide who's healthy and who is mild cognitive impairment. And we added to that, push the single resident homes together and far away from the multi-resident homes. And that did really well. So you can see that the temporal convolutional network, because it is capturing some of those nonlinear components, does a little bit better than the others. But with the pre-training, it really advances it. So the reason I bring that up is to show you that, yeah, there's a lot of challenges, but there are also always maturing machine learning ideas that allow us to try to attack those one at a time. Is there a clock here? I need to make sure I'm on time. All right, will somebody yell at me if I start to, 15 minutes? Okay, good. I'll go a little bit faster. Most of the work has been focusing on cognitive health, but we have been collaborating with nurses to look at how we can use this digital twin information to detect flare-ups of chronic health conditions, and that's even harder. We don't do this alone. This is our clinician in the loop. So we need clinicians who are familiar with all these different conditions and what to look for when there are flare-ups to help us drive the search. And here are two quick ways that we have done it. One is behavior change detection. We can take those behavior markers and aggregate them over a period of time, say 1 week at a time, and compare each one to baseline, and then see if there's a big change. And you can look at the paper to see how we determine significance, but the red line on the upper left chart is statistical significance, and this is a person who was diagnosed with lung cancer and then started to undergo treatment, radiation treatment. And when you see that small blip there on week 5, that's when she was diagnosed. And she actually said that she didn't react much, but her behavior changed that time. And the heat map shows that she was just spent a lot more time on the couch, maybe absorbing and planning. And then you can see much more dramatic impact, not only when the radiation treatment started, which is the green vertical line, but before it, because there's a lot more people coming into the home. And there's less sleep at night and more lying around during the day. So with the nurses kind of guiding us what markers to look for, we can identify changes like this. And we can identify other anomalies that are consistent with flare-ups. And anomaly detection alone is just not going to work for finding clinically meaningful deviations, because you're going to find they're out of the home on vacation, or the sensors are down, or a variety of reasons. But when we use clinician input to kind of guide the anomaly detection, then our method, which is the one on the left of the table, outperforms not only purely unsupervised anomaly detection, which isn't a big surprise, but also outperforms supervised learning of these flare-ups, because supervised learning needs a lot of data to train it. So this is kind of a middle ground, and the takeaway is that if you have a clinician guiding the machine learning algorithm, then it can be more effective at that. All right, so I promised I would close the loop, so I will finish out here with intervention. We have this memory management tool called Emma, which not only allows individuals with memory difficulties to have all their notes and appointments in there, but we connect it with the smart home. And if you can recognize activities, then you can forecast the context in which they're going to occur. You can say, all right, usually they take their medicine when they start eating supper, and we can recognize when they eat supper, so if they start eating supper, and we have not recognized that they took their medicine, then this connection between the memory management tool and the smart home will kick in. So here's Jess, who's been living there for a couple years, so the smart home knows her routines. She's taking her medicine, and she's supposed to take it with food, and so she's indicated that's a critical activity that she wants prompted. And when the smart home recognizes that she hasn't eaten like she normally does in that normal context, then she is prompted to go and eat. So that's an example, quick one, of how you could close the loop and provide an intervention that's still aware of that person's routine. 2 more quick ideas. I want to close that loop not only from assessment to intervention, but then back to sensing. And so all this graph shows you is that we had a study in which we incorporated the smart home markers with their use of the memory notebook, and we wanted to see if we could use the outcome of the intervention to improve assessment of the person. And in every single case, so these are on the x-axis are all those measures that I was talking about. In every single case, joint learning of the measures and fusion of Emma along with their behavior improved performance, except for one, and we have to go back and figure out why. Finally, we want to start adding more information. We want to add genetics. We want to add the audio interactions with individuals. We're starting to add some new cognitive assessment tasks through the watch. And we've been exploring how are we going to glue these together. And we wanted to see if language models could provide that glue. And so we tried gathering data from 4 different studies in which we had experimenter interviews, so we actually input the text. We had the digital markers, and so we had to have a connection between the language model and an inference engine so it could pull from it. It connected to all their personal information and stats, and then we also had it connect to papers, so it was aware of the literature and what behavior markers to look for, and see then could it actually outperform classical machine learning in diagnosing whether they're healthy or mild cognitive impairment, and it did, which again was a little bit surprising because the language models are not geared to be quantitatively predictive, but we were just able to feed in more information and, as a side benefit, have an interactive chatbot that would summarize the stats of that individual, provide the diagnosis, and explain why. And so I think there's a lot of potential here for putting the digital twin together. So the takeaways are that machine learning helps empower these digital twins by tackling those challenges one at a time, that the digital twins can improve health assessment and intervention. Every time we added more information, we were able to do a little better. The language models provide a pretty effective glue, so that's a good direction to pursue. And digital twins can actually improve traditional methods. I was telling my collaborators and people at NIH that it's so frustrating to use traditional methods as our gold standard for predicting cognitive health because it's based on laboratory tests, and how realistic is that? So we're starting to develop new in-the-moment assessments. For example, give them a list of words, and then the next morning when they put on the watch, you ask them to remember. Or things like, the next time you come home, because we can detect when you come home, press this button on the watch and do the arm curl test. So we get some measures of mobility, but they're personalized to that person's context, and we can see if they remember and when, and then we get the arm curl information as well. So we're starting to expand on that. But it is still really, really hard. I mean, we are now looking at data from almost 500 participants who have longitudinal smartwatch data and trying to do activity recognition in the wild, and it's just really ugly. So I look forward to all the ideas that you have to help us do that a little bit better. And thank you. Yeah, I sped through that last part, but
Sandesh?
Yeah, easy question. I came a little late. What is your working definition of a digital twin?
I was looking at it as a holistic model of the person. Now, our digital twin is starting from whatever we can sense. So we're starting from behavior and emanating out.
Thank you. That was really amazing. As a clinician, the possibilities are endless. And one of the things that's really important, particularly if you look at sort of the elderly population, is things like falls and frailty indices. Can you talk a little bit about, how you envision the digital twin sort of helping clinicians and physicians predict that?
Right. Well, many wearables are pretty good at this. Apple Watch is decent, but the difficulty is we've been told and have observed that there are so many different ways to fall, and that with a lot of older adults, it can be kind of a slow slump. And so actually, the gentleman in this picture was in one of our studies and asked that we use his picture as often as possible because he had Parkinson's disease and Sjogren's. So he was thirsty all night, and so he would keep getting up to get a drink of water. And this is where the clinician in the loop was really necessary because, yeah, there was an anomaly. It was 2 a.m. He was in the kitchen, and the motion sensor showed that he was just sitting in front of the stove for 20 minutes. And at 2 a.m, that's unusual. But anomaly detection alone would give you just so many false positives that unless you want to try to characterize every possible type of fall and use supervised learning, we've found that having a clinician kind of guide this indirect supervised learning has been effective.
Hi, I'm Pooja Chitre. I'm a PhD candidate at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. So I have a question about, so how much data is enough data for, digital twins? Because this, going back to the first keynote, does this really solve the problem of data deluge that we already have? Like, does it add to the data deluge that we already have?
Whatever you have, multiply it by.
Yeah, how much data is enough data?
Similar to that question is I get asked regularly what of these technologies are available now and what will be available in 10 years. And I would say all of these technologies are available now. Are they robust enough that you are going to deploy them with all of your patients? Perhaps not. And the analogy for me is wireless phones. When we first got them, they were really big. Only really wealthy people had them, and it had a lot of dropped calls. You couldn't move much, you couldn't hear well. But now it's ubiquitous. And so we found, I think that maybe the progression of studies even gives an indication in that we were able to predicted clinical measures with moderate to large correlation, but under controlled settings where we only had one person in the home. And we had ground truth every 6 months. And then when we went to multi-resident homes, it just fell apart. So how much data do we need? It kind of depends on how robust you want it to be. But the shorter answer that might get at what you're trying to look for is that when we're trying to extract digital markers from the smart home or smartwatch in order to perform assessment, we will do it with a minimum of 2 weeks of data because we want to see how they perform typical activities, but also what their routine looks like from day to day, weekday to weekend, 1 week to the next.
You go ahead.
I think that she's asking, it's not just how much data, but what kind of data do we need in order to complete the digital twin? And will it ever, well, no, I don't think so, because there are so many insights to human physiology that we don't have yet and methods for getting at that. And so there's so many clinicians out here who are much better able to answer that question than I, but certainly images, EHR, genetics, everything that I showed on that initial slide would be where I would like to go next. And we are finding some people to give us that data, but trying to get data on the individuals. And this is where domain adaptation is so important, because usually we have one cohort with this subset of information and another with another subset. So you have to piece together that puzzle.
Thank you. Next question.
I know this might be out of the current scope of the study, but are you accounting in the future for things such as temporary disability or worsening of conditions? I know that for your current population, there involves people with neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's. Are there any accounts for either worsening of condition or even in your healthy control population where, for example, car crashes happen, they may have been diagnosed with a chronic illness that they were not aware of, and there have been flare-ups that changed their category? Are there any kind of built-ins to account for those in the future or currently?
I don't know about built-ins, but we have encountered those situations. For example, in the clinician in the loop, we had individuals who were experiencing seasonal depression, so it was occasional, and then we had some individuals who were experiencing worsening mobility to the point where during the course of the data collection they had to switch to a walker and then to a wheelchair. And so, yes, we did look at those and detect those types of transitions and changes. And it doesn't always have to be a decline. We have collaborated with St. Luke's, which is an inpatient rehabilitation institute, to actually collect data and try to see how well they are progressing while they are there, typically for 2 weeks, with the goal of eventually then putting it in their home and see how they're doing from then on. So we can see how they're doing their physical therapy, then see how it's translating to their everyday life. Is that what you were trying to get at? Okay. Yes.
Diane, thank you. That's just such an amazing talk. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on activity identification. Specifically, like which activities are you good at sensing and which ones are most challenging, and how does sort of multimodal data collection, different kinds of sensors together improve that prediction? And then finally, if you could also say something about transitions, just personal experience and some of the work we've done. Transitions are really hard at detecting and then understanding one activity to the next. So if you could maybe expand on how you deal with that a little bit.
Interesting. Easy to identify activities typically have a very distinct motion pattern because of the nature of the sensors that we're using. So sleep is easy to detect, and walking, in a lot of the literature you'll see laboratory collected data that has walking, running, sitting, standing, climbing, lying down, and those are pretty easy to distinguish from each other. The ones that have some semantic ambiguity, like socialization and relax and work, are much, much harder. And I was talking with Hassan actually about the need to switch from activity recognition to activity detection, because you multitask. So you walk and work at the same time. And so instead of saying, here's 30 seconds, tell me which of 6 activities it is, we are trying to transition to, here's a month of data, identify every time that they are walking, every time that they are working, every time they are sleeping, and they may overlap. Your follow-up question, can you remind me? Transitions. Oh, well, I think that I would like to talk with you further, because we are using statistical change point detection techniques, but our goal, and there are a lot of them out there. RuleSIF is a really well-known one, ULSIF, and we were just trying to be able to detect it faster with less data and more accurately, so that when we detect a transition, it's usually happened X time steps ago, because you need to have data before and data after, and then see if the probability distributions look significantly different. And so we try to do it with a minimal number of points after the fact. So typically we find it 2 seconds afterward. And we have delivered interventions based on that, but it's only been with very small convenience sample. So that's as far as we've gotten, and we should talk more.
My question is about clinician input. Since you're using clinician input as one of the data points for maybe learning of the algorithm, but each clinician can have a slightly different view of an event. Like a significant fall means something very different to a nurse, to a geriatrician, to a ER physician, so that can create error and bias. How are you going to account for that?
I liked that you worded that in the future, because in the past what we had is that there was a team of nurses, and they all reviewed the notes and would agree upon when they felt that it was a flare-up in order to get consistency. But in the future, I can envision, first of all, having an ensemble, because you're going to have different perspectives, each of which is valuable for a different purpose, and that ensemble might indicate where the source of the ground truth came from, because that would, like you said, you were associating different people's caregiving roles with a different perspective. And so I would envision that that would become part of the model or ensemble.
All right. Time's up. I know there are more questions. Reza, you can take that offline during lunch. Let's thank our speaker. Thank you so much, Diane. I know you are very busy during everything else that you do. Thank you for making the trip and for the great talk. Thank you.